on videos you can watch, and of course the upcoming build conference will have more information about all this. And we'll go live in a few seconds when Rit says so. All right, so we're live. So my name is Shahed Chowdhuri. I work for Microsoft, not from here. I'm from the Northern Virginia area. Is anyone here from out of town, DC, Maryland, Virginia? All right, I see one hand and someone wearing a Maryland sweatshirt. Welcome to Philly Code Camp. I try to come every year, but last year I couldn't make it due to conflict. So I tried to make up for it by doing 2 talks today. I did a HoloLens talk with Azure Cognitive Services earlier, which is why my hair is a little messy and putting on the headset back and forth. And now we're going to talk about ASP.NET Core. So I've been working with the technology for a long time now. And when .NET Core came out, it was originally ASP.NET 5. It was pretty clear that it was not a replacement for regular ASP.NET. So then it was renamed to Core, it became 1.0. Since then we had 2.0. And 2.1 is coming up pretty soon, and it's already in preview. You can use it with the preview version of Visual Studio. So this talk is structured for people of all levels. So if you have some level of web development experience, that'd be great, but your ASP.NET experience could come from any direction. I'll make sure there's something for everyone. And for those of you who are advanced, whether you've had some ASP.NET experience, maybe with MVC, maybe even with Core 1.0 or even 2.0, I'll explain what's new so that hopefully there's something of value for everyone. All right? So as you can see, my Twitter handle there is @ShahedC. So if you want to find me on Twitter, send me a message or ask questions afterwards. I'll have my contact info at the end with my email address and phone number. My blog, wakeupandcode.com, where I usually post slides after an event. I'll be driving home after this, so I'll probably post it maybe after the weekend, but do stay tuned. Quick agenda for today. As I mentioned, it's a fire hose information, but I'll provide a lot of links, info, things you can get more info on. We're going to talk about .NET in both terms of the framework and the core version that's cross-platform. For those of you who can see on this side of the room, now lift it up here, I do have a MacBook here. And sometimes it's amusing to a couple people saying, hey, you already have your Windows machine. Why do you bring a MacBook, especially if you're an employee at Microsoft? And I say, well, here's the kicker. Underneath it, there's a little MS asset sticker there. So it's actually paid for by Microsoft. So it just goes to show the times have changed, where we not only produce applications which run in these different platforms, but also the tools to help you develop for virtually any platform out there. All right. So a quick intro of ASP.NET. So as I go through some of this information, don't worry about reading the text that's on the sides. These are actual websites, so later on when you download the slides, you can click on the link. But this is more of a visual for you to get a feel for where you can get your information. The best place to get started is one of many sites, ASP.NET. I know there's also a .NET, which is a really weird URL, DOT, and then the period, and then NET. And then, of course, there's different Microsoft sites where you might follow someone at Microsoft, such as Jeff Fritz or Scott Hanselman, who have a lot of public content, including blogs and video content on .NET. So we'll have a lot of information about that as well. .NET Core itself is under the Microsoft.com/net, yet another URL. I get a little confused sometimes, like where do I point people to? So I have a couple of main sites that I point to, the main ASP.NET and Microsoft.com/net. So this shows you that .NET is available in a variety of platforms. And even over here, we see people with both Windows and Macs over here. You may be using Linux on your PC as well, or even in the cloud. So I want to make sure that no matter which version of .NET you've come from in the past, you can find something that works for you today. Yes, question? Where can you get slides? So my blog, wakeupandcode.com, usually posts slides after an event. So there might be an older version of this, but this is something that literally updated before I came here. Actually, some of it was last night. So there's always up-to-date things. So latest version is not available yet. Good question. So across the different platforms, as you can see, when it was first announced, ASP.NET Core was called ASP.NET 5. And I show you these boxes because it sort of shows you the relative sizes of things compared to where we were before. Things are becoming a little more streamlined and lightweight. Not only the runtime, but also the framework itself. At the same time, what happened is that we have this .NET standard trying to bring all pieces together, sort of like one ring to rule them all. So whether you're using the full version of Visual Studio on Windows, the new Visual Studio for Mac, or VS Code on Windows, Mac, and Linux, you'll have something that you might be able to program for or target as far as your application is concerned. The .NET standard itself is not an API. Or it's not a framework. It's more of a standard where different versions of .NET can adhere to it, so that whether you're using .NET on Xamarin for mobile applications or ASP.NET Core, there is a standard that continues to be supported by the different flavors of .NET. And today we're only going to focus on ASP.NET. So just a quick show of hands. How many people actually worked on ASP, or the classic ASP as it is known now? Oh, I see a lot of hands. Cool. I started my career with that. It was pretty cool when I first started. I was like, wow, I'm building applications. I didn't know what an application was, but I knew some Visual Basic, I knew some Java, and I got a job working on for web development, and realized that I could quickly interact with a database. And things started getting a little messy. I learned the term spaghetti code. I learned about throwaway code, and then eventually moved on to ASP.NET Web Forms, which as a developer who started working on the web but also knew VB, made sense for me at the time. I was able to do web forms. And then as MVC came out, I really started to appreciate it, not just because it was more lightweight, and it started making use of my favorite language at the time, and still is C#. It also allowed you to do unit testing. How many people here have been using web forms or have used web forms before? And how many of you are now in MVC or continue to use MVC in any flavor? All right, see a few hands. So kind of a mix and match. There's web forms and MVC. So out of those folks who have done any sort of ASP.NET, how many of you are doing unit testing currently on your work projects? All right, not enough hands, right? So for those who did not raise your hand, go see the people who did raise their hands and ask them how it's going for them. Hopefully it's positive. Hopefully it's something you're able to do. With ASP.NET Core, when we first released it, we started supporting out of the box. I guess XUnit.NET was the most popular, and people always asked about MS Test. So a bunch of different testing frameworks available. So we don't tie you down to any particular one. You can use the built-in MS Test, which is always growing, but also you can use third-party tools as well. And then we had web pages and web API, but they're all use different namespaces and frameworks. So with the new ASP.NET 5, which is now ASP.NET Core, try to unify a lot of these, both within how you write the code as to what namespace you use, what parent classes. And this is most apparent in the parent controller you use for your controller. So whether you use an MVC controller or a web API controller, what you do is you still use the same controller class, and that simplifies a lot of things as we introduce more newer concepts as well. And the final thing that was added was a Razor web pages that was added in 2.0, and you'll learn SignalR, which is now available in the 2.1 preview. So anyone here used SignalR before? I see a couple of hands there. So SignalR is used for real-time processing. So let's say you want to, instead of waiting for something to load and having to hand code some AJAX code, what you can do is use SignalR and use the concept of sending messages in both directions. So a chat app being the most common thing, but also any sort of interactive thing where everyone needs to see the same data and do whatever you want with it. So it could be used for a game. It could be used for maybe an interactive planning poker app or anything you can imagine, whether in a game scenario or a business app scenario. But a lot of the version numbers were confusing to me initially, because ASP.NET, when I first made this slide, was ASP.NET 5. And then right now, we have Core. After 1.0, we had 2.0, and I put there 2.x because right now 2.1 is in preview. And it started off with running on both the full .NET framework and .NET Core, and C# continued to evolve. Right now it's 7.3. And then Core MVC lost its version number. So initially it was MVC, whatever the version was internally, that was different from the version of ASP.NET framework. But when Core came out, when 1.0 came out, they took off the MVC's version number. So whatever ASP.NET Core version is, it's just 1.0 MVC or 2.0 MVC. So MVC doesn't have its own version number. And SignalR, originally it was known as SignalR 3, coming soon for ASP.NET Core. But now it's just the SignalR that's available for ASP.NET Core 2.1. So the only version number you need to know is ASP.NET Core 2.1, and it has all these cool features along with it, such as MVC, Entity Framework, SignalR, and so on. So speaking of Entity Framework, how many people here do use Entity Framework or any ORM for their projects? All right, very good. So Entity Framework, again, a great way to talk to your database. So back in that older chart, when I first started doing the classic ASP, I had all these SQL queries directly in my code, not a very pretty sight. But with the entity framework, you make things a lot easier. You basically code, as you know, with your database. And we have a lot of features that are coming from regular entity framework into core entity framework or entity framework core. Because when EF Core first came out, it didn't support everything, just as .NET Core didn't support everything. So now we're trying to match feature parity where it makes sense, or even in some cases where it doesn't make sense. For example, .NET Core is cross-platform, Windows, Mac, and Linux, but some people said, hey, I want to use stuff that's only available in the full .NET framework, such as system.drawing. There is a new feature within 2.1, which is allowing you to, on Windows platforms, use some of those namespaces. So some of that is coming back in, and we'll see that as we progress in today's talk. Any questions so far in the intro? All right. So hopefully when we get into the code, you'll be able to make sense out of it, and I'll also explain for the people who are new to MVC, the basic structure of MVC, then we'll dive right in. So C#, again, it's progressed from 7.0 to 1.2.3 and so on. There's a bunch of different features that are available, and I mentioned some of these from the C# site, because when C#6 came out, a lot of it was what was called syntactic sugar, where it was just a nicer way of writing the same thing, where internally the IL or intermediate language code would still be something that's the same. You could just write different code, make it work. But with C#7, they changed a lot of things, as in instead of breaking changes or just syntactic sugar, the new additional feature. So you can still write code the old way, but newer, cooler way of writing stuff. So do check that out when you get a chance. It's not required for all the new ASP.NET, but it is useful to know what features are available. So that wraps up the agenda for the introduction. We'll go right into .NET Framework, and then we'll talk about ASP.NET, how it works, and we'll see some code examples for web projects, MVC, SignalR, and Web API. So where does .NET Core fit in all this? I mentioned there was a .NET standard that's being developed over time, and it's not just Microsoft, we're working with the community as well. So anytime you hear something from Microsoft that you have some feedback on, maybe you have some suggestions for improvement, or maybe there's something you don't like, feel free to speak up. So whether it's myself or the gentleman in the back, or Jeff Fritz, who is in Pennsylvania, works with Scott Hanselman and the ASP.NET team, you can provide your feedback, and if you have some constructive feedback, feel free to get in touch on Twitter, on email, or in person, whichever makes sense. Okay. So where this came from is using all the feedback from people. We try to standardize not only what we have in .NET, but also allow you to do more with it. So you see ASP.NET course right in the middle. I won't talk about the other things that are available, but just know that learning C# and .NET can take you a lot of places on any platform. The compilation process, it evolved over time as well. This diagram is actually pretty old, but it's still relevant. So when .NET Core was first announced, the new Roslyn compiler was announced, where it takes your C# code and converts into IL, and then whether it goes to the Windows Store or ASP.NET, the difference between what was done before and what's done now is that we bundle what you need with your application, with your reference DLLs, allowing you to have multiple versions of .NET Core on the same machine, and that is more lightweight. Instead of having everything, it uses just the pieces it needs. And also, I'll explain to you later on when we look at configuration files, how you can configure your ASP.NET application to use just the things you need. That's something that's evolved between 1.0, 2.0, and now 2.1. So the reason I mentioned these different version numbers is because you may come across some documentation that's fairly recent. Maybe it's from last year. You say, hey, this is from 2017. This must be how I do it today. Maybe something has changed because 2.0 just came out last year, and then 2.1 is coming out pretty soon because it's in preview. So something from 1.0 may have been published last year as well. So again, just keep that in mind. Things change pretty quickly, so it's useful to know what's relevant for you today. So if you're wondering, well, what about the full .NET framework? So anything that's 4.6 and higher, 4.7. This is a pretty busy slide, but what I wanted to point out here is that it is what they call highly compatible in-place replacement. So if you had an application that's still using an older version of the full .NET framework, but you just wanted to get started with .NET Core today, you could develop an ASP.NET Core app that runs on the full framework. You don't have to have it run on the cross-platform version, because the full framework only runs in Windows, and it's the only way to create Windows applications on .NET. But ASP.NET runs on all platforms, and it can run on the .NET Core runtime, but it can also run on the full .NET framework. So you can continue to use the full .NET framework if you want. and you can continue to build both Windows apps and also web apps. So that works for you. But ASP.NET Core is what we're here for. And one of these slides here a long time ago that was published initially when ASP.NET Core came out, you see these kind of marketing type buzzwords like it's cloud ready, modular, open, improved tooling. It sounds all cool, but what does it mean for you, right? The good news is that all this stuff is true. So instead of just making something and saying, hey, this is good for the cloud, the runtime performance benchmarks that we have, and this is all open source, it's out on GitHub. If you look up things like ASP.NET roadmap, ASP.NET benchmarks, even the code itself, we do a lot of open source stuff. And it allows you to be not only up to date on things that are coming out. In fact, everything that I talk about today is already things you could research on. So instead of having you look up 100 different websites, I bring you all the information today, but doesn't mean that you have to come here just to learn it. When you leave here from today, you'll have plenty of resources because everything is public. The only thing I can't tell you is unreleased information, obviously, I can't share. But what we do is we do have a public conference called the Build Conference. Anyone here not familiar with the Build Conference? All right, so the Build Conference is a conference Microsoft hosts for the public. So a few employees also go, but it's open to developers from all around the world. And it's become so popular, it sells out very quickly. Employers pay to send their employees to go there, or if some employees are maybe entrepreneurs, they might go by themselves, but that's very informational. But if you're not there in person, you can see all the information online as well as it's released on the day of the event through live videos and archived content as well. So very cool way to get all the info. So the information you see here today, again, make sure you go watch the Build Conference. If you have the chance to do so, you'll get even more info. So what does it mean to run on the full version of .NET, version .NET Core? So as of 4.6, you see there are a bunch of different items over here that I mentioned. So I'll read them out loud, but the majority of these, or you can just bundle them into two different categories. So it says cloud ready, modular design, dependency injection, and so on. But you get all of these with .NET Core as well. The difference is that with .NET Core, you can get a side-by-side deployment where you're deploying the runtime along with the application, and at the bottom it says fast startup and low memory. So you get the better performance. So in case you're wondering earlier, well, if I can run my ASP.NET Core applications on the full .NET framework, should I still do so? Or can I run on, do I really need to run on .NET Core? Two reasons you could is because you get the benefits of better performance, and also you get the benefits of having to go cross-platform when you choose to do so, or if you choose to do so. Also, one of the things is dynamic compilation. So I put up this XKCD comic. And if you've ever seen the XKCD comic, you'll know there's always a relevant XKCD for everything. So instead of wasting your time and battling with your friends in the hallways, you can no longer do this because as you're writing your code, you get this fast development, no build step process where you're developing stuff, you've deployed it, or you're running the application in development, and it compiles dynamically. So when you save it, you can just go back to your browser and refresh it again and continue to run it. So that being said, let's jump into MVC. Any questions so far in the higher level .NET Core? All right. So with MVC, feast on this for a second while I grab a quick drink. So if you work with MVC, and I know a lot of people in this room have, this should be very familiar. But if you've only worked with web forms, if you've never touched MVC before, this might be a little confusing. So I'll explain it very briefly, and then I'll just go right into the inner workings and how the code works. So the controller takes in the user requests that come in, and it updates the view that is then part of the presentation layer shown to the end user. And the view gets its data from your model, and then the controller is also responsible for updating that model, which is then used by the view. So as you can see, the controller does most of the work, can take in requests, it can generate views that are then sent to the end user, and is also responsible for updating your model or data points that are in the model. Models are represented by basic C# files. Let's say if it's a person model, it could be first name, last name, and so on, fields that make up an object. A view could be your HTML is presented to the user. In terms of ASP.NET MVC, you'll see a CS HTML files, which have the server-side code mixed in with your HTML. And the controller are all C# files that use the controller parent class for ASP.NET. So here's what a controller looks like. Can people see from the back? Is that clear? Okay. Let me know if I do need to zoom in, because when I'll go into Visual Studio, I'll zoom in on this again. So this will be sort of be a recap. So some things I've highlighted over here, the human controller name. So that's a convention. So this controller represents things you can do with records. Let's say if you're in a medical record database, you have some information about a human being. Maybe they have their first name and last name and patient records and so on. And every controller by default will typically extend from the controller parent class. Also, in this case, it's a database-ready app, so it uses something called the DB context. The DB context represents your connection to the database, where you can act upon it to get back data elements and also save back to the database as well. A couple of things that you would normally have in a controller class is get and post methods. Any of those HTTP verbs you know of, get, post, put, delete, and so on, you can send those messages back and forth. You can send data and come back with data. And again, if you work with MVC, these should be pretty familiar. And the way these routes are set up, where you can say human/details/whatever, this is also configurable as well. So a route is a way of connecting to your application and sending a message and calling a controller method and getting data back. So the way that these attributes work, anything you have in square brackets, you can attach it to your methods, and then you can have additional values on them. For example, the get methods are all HTTP get by default, and the post methods you have to decorate it with an HTTP post attribute. The MVC API controls are a little different, but they're also very similar in that there is this controller method or controller class you're still inheriting from, and this is a huge change from older versions of ASP.NET MVC. So back in the day, there used to be a separate API controller, and now you have the same controller parent class. But what's new in 2.1 is there is now an API controller attribute that makes it easier for you to handle requests and error messages and form validation within your API controller classes. And we'll cover that later as well. But you'll notice you have similar things. You have get and post methods that you can send back and forth. But in this case, you're just sending JSON data typically to any client that can consume JSON data. So any mobile developers here? All right, I don't see mobile developers, but web developers, I'm assuming, right? Because earlier a lot of hands went up for both ASP.NET and MVC. So think about the mobile front end. When you, let's say you write something with JavaScript to talk to a web API backend, you can use that for mobile as well. So let's say today you're not working on any mobile projects and you're thinking, hey, what should I learn all this stuff for? Tomorrow I want to get a job doing a mobile app, right? Well, mobile apps need a backend as well. And the backend can all be done with a web API. So you can have a single web API that takes care and handles a front end that's built with maybe Angular or even an MVC Web App. At the same time, you can also build a mobile front end, maybe with Swift or maybe with Xamarin, what have you, and build a mobile front end that consumes the same web API. So then you realize that you're not wasting your time learning one thing, because you can apply to a bunch of different things as well. The views, as I mentioned earlier, are pretty much HTML files that have some server-side code in them. Things that I do want to highlight here, on the very top it says @model and the namespace and the class name of a model that it implements, which allows you to do things like model dot, where you're able to get more model information. In this case, I'm displaying the user's first name in the model. And also, you'll notice there's something here called ASP-action, ASP-route ID. These are server-side tags. So these HTML tag helpers are fairly new, and they started off with ASP.NET Core, so you wouldn't have used them in previous versions of ASP.NET. And it expanded a little, so you can build your custom tags as well. So these are called HTML tag helpers, and you're able to build custom tag helpers, but there are also a lot of built-in ones that make it easier for you to create your forms. So instead of having a form tag with all these extra attributes, you can make it look just like HTML and minimize the amount of server-side code that you would need. Your form elements and the form itself can be done with regular HTML tags with server-side attributes. Okay, so I'm going to switch back and forth a couple of times. So right now, let me switch back to some code. So you see over here, this is a typical HTML form tag, right? But notice that it's purple. That's because I have the server-side action on it. So instead of separating out your server-side code from your client-side code, you have an HTML client-side looking tag, and on that you have these server-side attributes. So if you've been using ASP.NET Core up until now, this should be familiar to you. For those of you who have not used ASP.NET Core before, this is not new to 2.1. It's been around for a while now. Okay. So models, as I mentioned, they're just plain C# files, but the difference between regular C# files with properties and attributes are these attributes that you have. So for example, here I have a key attribute that's useful for indicating this is going to be a primary key, maybe for entity framework to use. Stuff like display name, that's automatically used by the MVC runtime. So when your web page is displayed, instead of showing first name without any spaces, it shows first space name with a space, or you can call it whatever you want, right? Maybe you have F name and L name and you want to spell out the words differently. So you can always configure your application to display something different than what your fields are called. Excuse me. Yes. Yes. So when you have an action name edit, you can by default map it to a function that's also called edit, but you don't have to. So let's say you wanted to create a function name that's different from what you're calling it. You can have a different definition for it. Again, it's configurable as well. So that way you don't also expose it in the URL. So as you know, back in the day, when you only had static files, let's say you had something.com/myfolder/myfile.html. Typically, that would be an actual folder and file. But many different systems have come out where you can use your own paths and routes. MVC makes it really easy to do that. But at the same time, if you have a controller and then a method, you would have by default controller name / method name, such as edit. But you can configure that as well, so it doesn't have to be. So Razor pages are fairly new, and this was a little confusing because those folks who have been working with ASP.NET for years, they've been using Razor views, and so they're wondering, well, it's not the same thing. So the Razor views were a little different in that the MVC view engine themselves, the newer version of it through the lifetime of MVC, got known as Razor views, but Razor pages are completely different. These are more standalone. They look like as if they're interpreted pages, but they're not. So it has the convenience of having a single page that lets you create simpler pages. Let's say I just want an about page. I don't want to create a whole controller and model and all the stuff you saw in the diagram. I just want a page that shows me something. Razor pages allow you to do that. So when it first got announced, I found this website. It has a really long URL, so I actually put it off to the side because I wanted to show as much as possible here. And things that highlight it, things that it is, and things that it's not. So it makes it easier to make those dynamic forms and focus on the page itself rather than the infrastructure. But at the same time, it doesn't take away all the stuff you learn about MVC. Behind the scenes, Razor pages still use the same MVC primitives. It still uses a controller behind the scenes, and what it's trying to do, what it's not trying to do, is not replacing something like PHP or any other interpreted language, and it's not hiding your C# domain stuff. Or creating new primitives. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So I'm going to go into another application, Razor Web App. So I guess I must have moved into different folders. So I'll just go ahead and pull it out of my work folder. Go to ASP.NET Core, Razor Web App, open it from there. And then I want to open it with a preview. So one thing you'll notice is that I have a lot of Visual Studios here, and I don't know if you can see when I zoom in on this, but the preview version is a little sketchy. It has some sketchy type lines on it, and the regular version is just a regular icon. And this over here is VS Code. Anyone here use VS Code currently? All right, cool, a lot of hands. So you may have noticed, I forget which time it was, it's changed it to an orange icon, and then people were like, why is it orange? And maybe it was during Halloween, I'm not sure. But then now it's blue again. So obviously we're listening to the people giving you what you really want, right? So this Razor Web App here, check this out. It says pages. there's no MVC folders, no models, no views, no controllers. Where is everything? Right here, you have an about page. This one was created simply by saying file new project, get me a new web project, right? I'm just going to go ahead and create a release version of this and run that. On the lower left, it says build succeeded. On the lower right, I have IS Express running, and the page should be loading in a few seconds. But one thing you'll see is that the page is over here as soon as it loads. Let's go to the about page, and here's the contact page. It looks like it normally would. So again, just to recap, contact would typically mean you have a contact controller, and just by having no file name after it means typically that it's the index method, which will find an index folder and have a view on it, or actually say a contact folder, which will have a view on it called index.ch.html. If you didn't catch any of that, it just shows how complicated that is. Just to have one page, you need a controller file. You would also need a subfolder for your views, and then index.html that would get called just because there's an index method in the contact controller. So what Razor does is says, okay, you know, let it work the same way behind the scenes, but up front, all you have to do is create a contact file. So here's the file, contact.cs.html. But check this out. It says use this model, but what's new is this add page directive, right? So you have the add page directive that says this is a new Razor page, and the contact model is the model it's going to use. That way I can do add model something something if I wish to, and then you can still do stuff behind the scenes if you want your C#. It makes it very clean. So it has stuff like on get and on post to do your get request and post request. So in this one, it's saying if the this method is called, if when this page is loaded, set message to your contact page, and inside here there's model add model.message, and that comes from contact model. And what does contact model look like? Similar to how you would see your contact or any other model, you have your public properties, and in this case you have an onGet method here. So this contact model, as you can see, it looks like it's directly beneath it as a subpage, but when you create a new Razor page, you automatically get that with you. So that works pretty well in that it's very lightweight. It lets you create one single page, and then all the model stuff, you do the add model for the model name, and you can write the code behind it. Okay, so that makes it a little easier instead of having controller view model and all that stuff. And none of that stuff is going away. This is not replacing MVC views. So Razor pages make it easier to have this simple websites where you would normally think it's a lot of work just to create a page that shows some information without taking away everything that you know and love today. Yes? Can you expand on that question? You can, yes. Yeah. Big. You want to repeat the question a little louder? Okay, yes, sir. For the microphone. Yes, he was saying that if you have a standalone Razor page, could you still use it as a template, or did I misunderstand the question? Okay, for layouts, yes, you can. So for, let's say, if you have a Razor page, you want to use it with your layout that's used across pages on your site. Okay, and the answer is yes, you can do that. Sorry, I misunderstood the question. Yes. Not that I know. So the question was, can Razor pages be used created dynamically and then used? I guess the HTML pages themselves are dynamic. So if you compare to a site that has static HTML pages versus a dynamic web application framework like ASP.NET, every page is dynamically generated. But the Razor pages themselves, you also want to generate dynamically. You're sort of generating HTML dynamically anyway. So it's still compiled. So is your concern that will it be dynamically compiled? Yeah, it'll still be dynamically compiled. And one of the things that is in 2.1, I'll cover that later as well, is that we're introducing, even during the build process, not only just runtime compilation, but build time compilation for Razor, without taking away that the dynamic compilation which we're doing during the editing process itself. So hopefully that's a good balance between getting performance out of Razor and also the flexibility of writing what looks like interpreted code. Any other questions? All right, so a quick way to get started is the Microsoft intro to Razor Pages site. So this gets continuously updated, and sometimes you'll see the date and the contributors on the top, but also you can provide feedback as well. So the reason I like to show this is that we're moving a lot of stuff, if not everything, to docs.microsoft.com. So it's a great place for you to not only learn, but also provide feedback. And also you'll see when something is new, it'll tell you this was just added in 2.1. Okay? So some of the syntax we saw earlier, this is a quick recap of what you saw in Visual Studio. Everything is under the Pages folder by convention. And again, with MVC, it helps to start with convention when you're new to it. So typically when I talk about what we can do within the application, I always follow the convention, makes it easier to get started. Once you're comfortable with it, if you want to reconfigure things to have custom routes and custom locations for things, feel free to do so. But the first time you have someone new joining your team, they might be utterly confused because they'll think, hey, you're not following conventions for anything. So you can stop following conventions at your own risk, but I always suggest going with the conventions, at least to start with. SignalR and ASP.NET Core, this is in preview. So there is some quick code that shows a server-side hub. There's a chat hub here. It uses the hub parent class. It has a bunch of async methods on connected and on disconnected. So here you can see it says await clients.all.send async. The clients in this case are the JavaScript code that's consuming the server-side SignalR hub. And in this case, the send method over here is sending a message to everyone. In this case, the send action and send message are methods that are on this client side, and you're able to send a specific method. So I'll show you a quick example of SignalR as well. But just note that this is using ASP.NET Core.SignalR, and this is a new addition to ASP.NET Core 2.1. So Razor Pages was added in 2.0, SignalR was added in 2.1. Let's see if I can find SignalR. So Entity Framework, it was rewritten initially, and it did have all the features, and now they're kind of achieving feature parity, both for performance and things you can do. For example, a number of databases. Right now, there's Azure Cosmos DB support that was just added. And for SignalR, what type of things were you doing before? And any concerns you had, things that wasn't supported, or? Right, so SignalR is in a different state just because it's been newly added to ASP.NET Core. So as far as I'm concerned, it's started with the intention that it will work similar to how you had used it before .NET Core. But I'm sure as time goes on, maybe even the weeks ahead, people will point out, hey, this isn't working and this isn't working. So yeah. So here's a quick SignalR controller. I forget what my controller is called. Maybe it's chat. Yep, it is. So I'll go ahead and log in as this user. I don't think that's the right password. Let me try it. Try that. All right. So I'm there. Let me try it in a second completely different browser. Okay, just logged in, so let me go back to the chat window. And then over here, yeah, try that. And then over here, let's say I want to say hello, and so similar to, let me open that in separate window. I messed up my session. All right, so let me try that again. So this one says, okay, so now it's working. So a lot of this stuff, again, being in preview, sometimes things might not work as expected. So if something doesn't work, something seems broken, try it again, or give us some feedback. Some things might be really broken, they might need help. You can open up issue requests in GitHub as well. You can reach out to folks on social media. So this, again, similar to chat apps that you have seen before. So what it essentially does is allows you with the browser, with a couple of lines of code, to send messages back and forth. And here I have the chat hub page that takes care of my data, and I have the chat.shtml to receive that information. So if I scroll over here, I have the append message. As you recall, it's not coincidence that append message is the same name as, actually, hold on, let me go back here. Okay, so here's what I'm looking for. So over here, you have your connection that you open up with the hub/chat. Again, this is by convention. And then you have connection on, you have the send message and send action. And if you compare to the chat hub, you have the send action and send message. And you'll see these correspond to these. So whatever you want to do with it, and then you call append message, which is this client-side method over here. So you can call it whatever you want, but you can talk back and forth. And this is one way, similar to how SignalR has worked before, way to connect to the server side without having to wait for something. So you may have heard of polling methods in the past, where you're asking or the server is asking the client, hey, is something there? Is something there? Is something there? You keep doing that. With something like this, you have a subscribe option where just because you have multiple clients, the server can keep track of how many clients are connected, and also the clients know at all times to not only contact the server, but receive messages from the server as needed. Okay. And I believe your local Chris Gomez over here, there he is. You've had some SignalR talks in the past, right? Have you started working with this 2.1 stuff yet? All right, cool. So as there's more development in SignalR, you know who to get to locally to ask about SignalR. All right, cool. Yeah, so it's been gone for a while. So people use hacks and other ways to use SignalR in their MVC core apps, or they just use older ASP.NET. But you can use SignalR now natively. So what's new? So let's quick time check over here. So right now it's 3:45. How much time do we have? Half hour? Okay. So this is a pretty busy slide. There's a lot of stuff here. I won't talk about everything in detail. What I want to do is, as we're going back between Visual Studio and the slides, so I wanted to give you some information. And there's a URL over here, talking.net.com. Developer in the community wrote a very nice post about some of the information that's coming out of Microsoft. And I'll provide information on a couple of videos you can watch on Channel 9 as well. And Build, obviously, is coming up soon. So SignalR, obviously, it's new. So what's new in it? Allows you to do the real-time web development just as before. But there's a new TypeScript client. It's no longer dependent on jQuery. And it has a couple of built-in hub protocols, but also allows for custom hub protocols. So use JSON-based protocol for text. There's something called message pack for binary. And it uses a scale-out model that's improved now if you need to scale for more users, better performance. And there's something within that requires sticky sessions. So again, for a very high level, There's some improvements and some restrictions and some newer flexibility for SignalR. HTTP protocol being required, this is a little bit of a change. So a lot of people are developing applications, business applications, HTTPS, but when you do it locally, everything's just regular HTTP. So what it does is right now in Visual Studio, the default templates all have a certificate that it sets up locally, so you can actually run an HTTPS locally. And it makes it easier by turning on HTTPS direction by default. So if you try to go to HTTP, it'll redirect to HTTPS. You can force that. This is all configurable, so the template has a line of code that literally says use HTTPS direction in the config file. And we'll take a look at it in a bit later. But there's something called the HSTS protocol. It's more for non-development scenarios. So in your config file or your startup.cs, there is an if statement that says whether it's development or not. In the non-development environment, it would use the HSTS protocol, but it would still use HTTPS locally. And the new Web API conventions, this doesn't invalidate what you know about Web API. What it does do is allows a new API controller that automates model validation and some of the error messages come through. Makes it a little easier to do things, and we'll see an example of that as well. Swagger support. Anyone here use Swagger? All right, I see this half of the room. So this half of the room, you can talk to these folks over here for all your Swagger questions afterward, right? And I try to point people out just because, you know, I won't be here tomorrow. I have to drive back to Virginia tonight. But hopefully you'll have found some new faces in the room and you know who's working on what. You can mingle afterwards and find out more info. But so Swagger helps you create that API documentation. There's some download involved, a little bit of configuration, but you can go to your Swagger URL just to see what your API looks like, your input, output, and documentation, and so on. It's a little easier this time around. Your API methods, they can now, instead of just returning an action result, it can return an action result of type T, whatever you want it to be. That way, if it is returning any specific type, it can indicate whatever response you need for any action result. So instead of just a generic action result, it can be for a specific type. So let's say if you have a data of some patient records, it can maybe be the patient type that you're returning. HTTP Client Factory starts to make it a little easier to configure HTTP client instances. So anything that's communicating with the backend through HTTP. We try to make it a little easier for you to do what you may have done before. ANCM, it's a weird acronym, stands for ASP.NET Core Module. So this is a native IIS module that hooks into the IIS pipeline. So this has been around before on ASP.NET Core, but the new one, it integrates with IIS a little better. So if you're running on Windows Server, if you're running an IIS, this makes it a little easier. So although we're going cross-platform, doing a lot of things with performance everywhere, we haven't forgotten Windows and IIS, so that's still there. ASP.NET Identity, this is now used as a UI library and implemented as a package. So if you're doing identity in your application, as most business apps do, you can now get it as a NuGet package. GDPR, who knows what GDPR is? Who has been to a website where there's a pop-up that says, we have cookies in our website, accept these cookies? I'm sure you've seen that. That's what the GDPR thing is. So you probably noticed the more websites you go to, every website, if you use a new browser to go to it, everyone's telling you, we have cookies. Well, if you've been using the web for the past few decades, you know every site has cookies. But they're just suddenly telling you about it, not out of the goodness of their hearts, but because there's some legal ramifications behind it and penalties and fines. So to make it easier for you not to get sued, Microsoft has added the GDPR compliance stuff within ASP.NET, especially within the templates. So you're asking the user for their information to consent to it, the language behind it, the accept button and all that. That's included with ASP.NET templates. So if you create a new Core 2.1 template, this stuff is built in. Because developers, what do we know about legal stuff, right? I don't know about you, but I always tell people, I'm not a lawyer and don't take any legal advice from me. But hopefully there's some folks that have worked on this that understand the law better than I do. All right, virtual authentication schemes. I haven't got a chance to use this yet, but from what I understand, there's different types of authentication schemes, and you can mix and match them. Make of it what you will. Build time Razor compilation. I know there was a question earlier about Razor compilation. This is compiled during the build process, so that when it starts up, it doesn't have to just-in-time compile. But at the same time, it also helps you it hasn't taken away anything you've had before in terms of when you're developing Razor pages, where you have the benefits of writing code and then automatically going to your pages and seeing it live. And there's also new Razor SDK. So think about all these class libraries you've developed and all the server-side code, but a lot of the time, the client-side code is just not reused. You have something, and then you copy and paste something, you modify that a little. But to make things easier to share across projects, you can now have a new Razor SDK, and you can share it across projects because you can now have a Razor UI library. So again, you can use it, do it internally, or you can publish it as well. And last but not least, MVC functional text fixture. So I know a lot of people weren't doing unit testing, but if you want to do end-to-end testing for everything, like including all this stuff that's mentioned here, your controller view pages and so on, for functional text, there is a different fixture available that helps you towards that. So usually when I get through this, I revamped this completely last night. First time I did this for ASP.NET 5 before it became Core 1.0. I had everything listed out, and this stuff has completely changed because a lot of this stuff is new here. But these aren't the only things. There's more things to know, and I'd like to just highlight that these are some things that I was excited about, but there was a lot of stuff that you can still find out if you follow some of those links. Some people here are using Entity Framework, not everyone. In case you're wondering what it does, this is the simplest diagram I put together. I put a little cloud in the middle. So this is your ORM. This is where the magic happens, object relational mapping. You have your entities in your code. There's all your C# code that says, this is an object that might be stored in my database, and the database is right there. You never have to write SQL code again. You don't even have to update your database manually. You can automate the whole process, which is pretty scary for some DBAs I've worked with. I was like, what do you mean you're going to automate everything? So I won't name any names, but I did work with a client one time where this was at a previous job, so not while I'm at Microsoft, but at a previous job for another client. And we had a couple of DBAs. They wanted to meet with the development team, and we came up with this new ORM thing, like, hey, we're going to use EF6 or 5, I think EF5 back then. We're going to automate all this stuff using code-first migrations. We're going to write code that represents the entire database, the data models, all the relationships, and we'll even automate the deployment. They were like, well, what are we going to do, right? So anyway, they were our paying customers, so we met with them every week to explain to them what will be changing in that week's code, and they had specific guidelines on how we wanted to name our tables. The customer table was something like TBL _ table customer, whatever it was. We said, okay, no problem. Because we called our customer object in C# this customer, or whatever you want to call it. And then you can configuration in your code, you can name it whatever you want it to be. Same with indices and your foreign keys, primary keys, relationships, and so on. You can have Entity Framework with migrations name everything automatically, or you can configure that too. So we were able to find a good point. The reason I mentioned this story is because if you use Entity Framework for your projects, if you don't get to call the shots, someone somewhere might tell you, no, we don't want to do this. That's kind of messy. Or I don't want you to running these SQL scripts in production automatically. So with Entity Framework, you can run things automatically and update the database. You can blow out the database, or you can just generate SQL scripts that can be then inspected by human beings and then later scheduled to be run in the production database. So you have that level of power or flexibility, whatever works for you. Most people, when they're trying to introduce Entity Framework in their place of work, whether it's at your current place or maybe at a future place, you're going to face some friction, and you can find some good balance by making sure you set their minds at ease that you're not taking away what they currently have. So the differences between Entity Framework 6 and higher, and then Core, in this case, Core 2.1, we try to make a lot of changes. Here's a screenshot that I took from one of the videos. So a lot of stuff going on here. I like a couple of the things here. On the top, I'll call them out. Basic lazy loading. Anyone know what lazy loading is? If you look at the lazy, some of the documentation we have on this, so there's eager loading where you load all the data and the data structure for something. But lazy loading is that you don't load it right away. You maybe have it all laid out, but you pull it out later. This was something that was not included in EF Core. This is new in 2.1. Right in the middle, somewhere near the bottom, we have data seeding. So you don't always have new data, right? I talked about blowing away the database. If we're going to blow away the database, you're going to have to put some data in there, maybe a list of states, and when you have a form that has a list of countries or whatever it is. you can use that in your data seeding methods, and we try to improve that, building on top of what we've had before. And at the very bottom, the Azure Cosmos DB. Cosmos DB is fairly new. There was a bunch of databases that have come out that are not the typical RDBMS. So Azure Cosmos DB was born out of Document DB. But there's something that a lot of developers have started using, and people have asked, hey, I want to use it with Entity Framework out of the box. So we've included some support to make it easier to do so. You can use EF for that. So any questions on EF? All right, cool. So if you haven't used it, there is, the person I learned it from was Julie Lerman, who has a ton of content online, including a Pluralsight for Entity Framework. And everywhere I go, I've met some speakers over here who say, yeah, I know Julie Lerman, I just saw her in Vermont. So yeah, she goes around to all these conferences and speaks, but also she does a lot of digital content as well. So if you want to learn Entity Framework, that's the best place to learn. But this new stuff that's coming out, right away, I'll give you some links to learn further. So earlier, we saw Visual Studio 2017, right? So what's the difference between that and VS Code? Well, VS 2017 itself has been massive, but the new installer, we made it a little lightweight comparatively. Instead of downloading everything at once, you download the installer, you choose just the pieces you want based on what you want to work on. File, project, web, when you create a new web project, you see the templates that are available. So right now, the current version of it shows you up until the 2.0 templates. You'll notice that aside from the empty, there's a web API. There's two different web apps. One is for the Razor pages I just showed. One is for the MVC. So if you don't want to start with an empty template, you're just new to this, you can start off with one of those templates. So it's a little confusing here. The one that says just web application by itself, that's the one with the Razor pages. So that begs the question, wait a second, if it's just called web app, does that mean that Razor pages is taking everything away? No, it's not. Kind of looks like that's like the new thing, but this one was just spelled out. So this is the MVC version, this is the non-MVC version. And you can mix and match. Basically, since everything is using the same controller parent class, starting from empty, you can get to any one of these states. And if you start from any one of these, you can have a web API today. You can add Razor pages to it, no problem. And if you like to do some JavaScript, React work, there's also multiple application templates as well for that. Visual Studio 2017, this one's a little tricky. It's not, the latest preview version isn't out yet, the one with 2.1. So if you go to the preview site, you can download the preview version. I have to install this and also .NET Core 2.1 preview. So when something's not released yet, you download it from a couple of different places. And then what it will do is suddenly it will add in 2.1 to the templates as well. And then a second problem I found was I deployed to Azure and nothing worked. So I realized I had to add this ASP.NET Core Runtime extension. So again, these are things that are very new with 2.1. You got to install the new Visual Studio Preview. You have to install .NET Core Preview, and then I have to enable this in Azure. So once it goes into release, these things will go away. But this is for early adopters. If you want to get started early, you have to take a couple of extra steps. But these were all one-time things I had to do right away. VS Code, a lot of people here use VS Code, so you probably are aware it's available on Windows, Mac, and Linux. I want to bring it up on both sides because we're a little short in time. But on the Mac, it works the same way. So you have VS Code over here. I love to use a terminal that's built in here. So let's say I have a SignalR tutorial, but let's say I just want to go back. I'm over here, and I create a new directory, and I called it my Philly Code Camp app. And then it's supposed to create a new directory, right? And let me go inside it. I have nothing in there. Let's say I want to create a new project. I can do all this by the command line. So I showed you all these things you can do with File New Project. If you do .NET New, I lost my mouse there, .NET New, and it'll tell me, hey, I need some more information. Like I'm going to call it .NET New MVC, which uses the MVC template. That's just one example. There's so many. And the authentication type, I can spell individual, right? And then maybe create, actually, I want to stay in the current folder because I'm already in it. But you can do -O for your output folder. And that will create a brand new project. And all the files using the template takes a couple of seconds, restore with my packages. And while it's doing this, the resource exceeded. So let's see if it's really there. If I open the folder within ASP.NET Core, there's my MyPCC app. I did all that in the command line. And if you look on the left here, the things that it created, check this out. All my controllers, models, views, and so on. Created everything on the fly. So let's say I'm going to open my home controller. You'll see, hey, my thing at the bottom just went away, right? There's a command for that. That's Control J. And it says, hey, required assets are required. Do you want to build them? And I say yes. So if I go to this terminal, I can do .NET build, and that builds it, right? I can run it from here too. So let's say I want to do .NET run. And then see it's actually running on a port. And it says, hey, this is starting to run with HTTPS by default. Works a little differently on your VS Code versus Visual Studio 2017. On Visual Studio 2017, it sets the SSL certificate. And over here, it enables the HTTPS, but doesn't set it right away. So I don't know if that will change shortly, but this is the same project that I just created. So a couple of lines of code that I just wrote over here allows me to very quickly do that. And you may be wondering, well, let's say I would do all this stuff in VS Code. I want to use Visual Studio, but I still want to use the command line. Well, the good news is you can do that too. If I go back to ASP.NET Core, my MVC Web App, and then check this out. There's my web project. So the only difference is that it doesn't create an actual solution file. But I can actually open that project, and I have two versions of Visual Studio on my machine. So by double-clicking on it, it tries to open it in the regular version of 2017, not the preview. So what I'll do is let me close some of the other ones I have. And let me close that. I don't want to save that right now. I want to use my selector to open it. So right-click, open with, and Studio Selector. And now you notice that it uses the preview version, because I also have that installed. So you can install them side by side, but double-clicking on it, unless you have it set, it may open the wrong one. You can now open, it's the same project, right? And when you try to close it, it'll say, do you want to save the solution? Because it just dynamically created a solution for you. So use it as you see fit. So to wrap things up, we created a project using the command line, and we opened it up in Visual Studio Code, and we went to Visual Studio full version and saw that it had the project but didn't have a solution file. So we were prompted to save it. So once you save it, you can still work in that folder using VS Code, but in the full version of VS, you'd be using the solution. Couple of things on wrap up. The startup CS configuration. This has been changing over time from the ASP.NET Core versions. So the main two things to notice, configure services and configure. You can configure every single thing, like adding entity framework, adding MVC, enabling, and so on. So you can have a bare bones project with nothing in it, and you can slowly start to add everything in the pipeline. This step over here, I think I have two things sitting on top of each other, but what this one says is the project.json file that used to exist before, it no longer exists. So we've replaced it by putting all your config file stuff inside the CS project file. So the CS project file is what you open up in Visual Studio, but if you right-click and edit it, this is what it looks like. And as you can see, it says Microsoft ASP.NET Core.all, because when this first happened, this file was really busy, but .all allows you to have all your references defined by this one all. This is changing slightly in 2.1. So all still exists, but going forward, we recommend using .app, so that way it doesn't pull in everything for ASP.NET Core. It only pulls in the things you need for your app. And I have a link for that too as well in github.com under ASP.NET announcements. The project properties, what's important to note here is that some of the environment variables we have, whether it's in development or not, that's defined. But just because you see it in the UI doesn't mean it's not configurable. Everything you see under project properties, that's in the config file as well. You can edit it yourself. So again, right-click properties, change things as you wish, and then just go into your source control system and see what changed. You can see exactly where changes are, and the next time you don't even have to open this. You can go directly in your config files and change stuff. You can choose different profiles to run from within Visual Studio. Live unit testing, I mentioned this briefly. This is not available in the Community Edition of Visual Studio. It's on, I think, the Enterprise version. Live unit testing, what it does is as you're writing your code and writing your unit test, it'll dynamically check everything. And then as it's happening, it doesn't even have to be with MS Test. It could be with XUnit as well. It'll give you little check marks and red X's and so on to tell you if your tests are passing or not. This is very easy because it does it automatically. It does have to be enabled within Visual Studio. in the enterprise version. I put a demo slide at the end, but I ran demos throughout the talk, so hopefully you got something useful out of it. We covered Visual Studio 2017, a high-level overview of .NET, ASP.NET, then we went deep inside a lot of the features that are available in 2.1. We talked about the newly added Razor Pages in 2.0 and the newly added SignalR in 2.1. If you're wondering, well, how do I migrate all this stuff from what I had before? We have some migration guides on docs.microsoft.com. If you want to check out the CLI, the command line interface that I had in GitHub, everything is open source. You can check it out there. Some of the command line things that I ran earlier, .NET New. You can run web, MVC, Razor, Angular, a bunch of different parameters. CLI commands in case you wanted to log into Azure and deploy things and do all that within the command line. So let's say you're working on your Mac or your PC. It's exact same commands. You can deploy to a Linux container and Azure. So that way you're fully cross-platform. Actually, if you have a Linux box, VS Code works the same way as well. I don't have that on me right now. But yeah, it lets you interact with Git. It lets you deploy to Azure. And you can do all that within command line. And as you know, anything you can do in the command line, you can automate as well. So use it as you see fit. And so that was a quick run through of everything that I thought was useful for ASP.NET Core 2.1. So how do you learn more information? Check out some blogs. We have msdn.com, web dev, which is run by Jeff Fritz from Philadelphia. And then we have Scott Hanselman's blog at hanselman.com. Visual Studio 2017 had a launch video that covered a bunch of things for Visual Studio and ASP.NET. But also at Build 2017, we covered .NET Core 2.1. Most of it is very relevant today. But if you're wondering, well, what changed in 2.1? All this stuff I heard today, I totally forgot. How do I get a recap? So we have videos for that too. 2 parts. So the roadmap, part 1 on channel 9. This covers everything in 2.1 you heard today. And if you wanted to see code in action, part 2 covers that as well and talks about new features that are available. Build conference coming up. I know a couple of people are going from here, so you have a lot of stuff to look forward to. Jeff Fritz on YouTube, so if you haven't been there already, I know Chris Gomez has some cool tips on videos as well. So again, for SignalR and video stuff, go to Chris Gomez. Other video sources, .NET Con, that's with the community, not just Microsoft people talking to the community. And of course, anywhere in channel 9, just look for videos and stuff. Docs.microsoft.com, I mentioned that a bunch of times. ASP.NET Core release, roadmaps. I mentioned this a couple of times, this mean stack. We heard everyone has a cool name. You got your MongoDB, Express.js, and whatever they have on the mean stack. And I was like, hey, why don't we have something cool, right? So I came up with a nice stack. So it's not the mean stack, it's a nice stack. And then it's obviously .NET, C#, IS, C#, and Entity Framework. So I bought that domain name, nicestack.io. Doesn't do anything, it just redirects to my NiceStack site. But hopefully I'll have something on it soon. But anyway, those are the references. These are some other resources. I'll leave you with this because it has my contact info and wakeupandcode.com. And I'll try and post the slides after the weekend. Thank you very much.